Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I wanted to take a look at some common misconceptions and kind of not exactly bad advice, but often poorly expressed advice regarding high passing your different sounds in your mix. So it's common practice to high pass most of your non-bass sounds in a mix. This helps you to clean up your low end and avoid muddiness while allowing your bass to come through the mix clearly. But some people will tell you to high pass everything or high pass all of your non-bass sounds, which I disagree with. I do end up high passing the majority of my non-bass sounds, but there's no point in high passing sounds that have no low frequency information that you wish to remove. And high passing these sounds can actually increase the peaking level of those sounds and increase the amount of headroom that sound takes up in your mix. Now that doesn't always happen, but it happens in some cases. So let's take a look at a couple of saw lead sounds. So you should be able to hear that this saw sound is very clean. And if you look on the spectrum, there's not really any low frequency information below that fundamental. Yeah, it's a very, very clean saw sound. But if we look at this similar sounding saw, we can see that there's quite a bit more low frequency information below the fundamental. And so you can see this on a spectrum, and you should be able to hear this as well. And I'll low pass that so you can really hear it well. So here's the clean version. And you really don't hear anything. And here is the not so clean version. Yeah, if I boost that a little bit, you can hear it better. There's just like some noise down in the low frequencies, and in the clean version there isn't. So if you're using this dirtier saw sound, you probably would want to use a high pass to filter that out. And just clean up those low frequencies some. But if you're using the clean version, there's really no need to use that high pass. And you can see that without the high pass, I'm peaking at about, -8 to -7 decibels. But if I turn that high pass on, I'm peaking several decibels higher, up at, -5 to -3. So if your goal is to get a loud mix, it's not always the best idea to high pass every sound blindly. You really should have a reason behind high passing a sound. And with a sound that is as clean as this one is, there's really no reason behind it. Unless, of course, you wanted to affect the sound itself. So if you didn't want the sound to sound like this, but rather wanted it to sound something like this, then yeah, you would high pass it, of course. But if your goal behind the high passing is to keep your sounds clean, is to give your bass room to breathe, and also to get a loud mix, because that's one thing that a lot of people will tell you, high passing your sounds help you get a louder mix. Then if you're using a very clean sound like this, it's not exactly the case. And there's really not a point in high passing it if those are your goals. So you'll probably be able to hear any unwanted low frequency information that you should high pass. And alternatively, of course, you'll be able to see it on a spectrum. as you can in this example. And as you can in this example as well. Now in this example, you don't really have a bunch of low frequency information except for way down at the bottom. And that is definitely something you want to remove. That's something that I'll cover in a little bit more depth later on. But just be aware that if you see kind of a presence on your spectrum in, the lowest frequency range, like basically 0 hertz, that is something you would want to remove. So, if you're gonna high pass for the purposes I've mentioned, really make sure that you have a reason to high pass. Make sure that you are actively and consciously removing frequencies, more so than just, following the advice to high pass, everything, as a lot of people will tell you to do. And if you really want to high pass everything, it's not going to be the end of the world. It just kind of can affect your ability to get the loudest mix possible if you're high passing certain really clean sounds unnecessarily. Now, in addition to this, some people will tell you to high pass your bass at a certain frequency, which I also disagree with. This is usually advice that originates from acoustic music and mixing acoustic music, where you don't have or want a huge sub-bass presence in your tracks. But doing this in electronic dance music can result in a weaker bass, or a bass that is unbalanced across the range of notes it plays. And by that I mean the lower notes will have a lower amplitude than the higher notes because of that high pass. And depending on the kind of electronic music you're making, that's not really something you want. So, for example, dubstep. If you were to high pass your bass at 50 hertz, you're pretty much losing practically an octave of sub-bass, or you're reducing the levels of certain frequencies in that octave that could be used in the track to have a nice, huge, full sub-bass. And honestly, if you have basses like this, where there's no low frequency information below the fundamental, you can see that this is just truly a pure sine tone. There's not really any reason you should be high passing it. The only reason you would want to high pass it is if you have some really low frequency information like this, or if you have pitch bends and pitch drops where your bass kind of goes from a reasonable frequency like this all the way down to some really quite low frequencies. And when you do that, you would probably want to set your high pass, but you'd probably want to set it more low rather than at 50 hertz or 40 hertz like a lot of people might suggest. So rather than those, you might set it at just below 30 hertz, or it's really up to you where you would set it. But if what you have is just a bass like this, that doesn't really go into absurdly low frequencies and is very clean, then there's not a whole lot of reason to high pass it unless you're trying to achieve something specific. And in some cases, you may find that you do want to high pass your bass. So I don't want to rule that out completely, because sometimes it can be helpful. And essentially those times that you would want to do that is when you want to put emphasis on harmonics that are not the fundamental. So if we take a look at this example here, you can hear that the bass is quite a bit more than just a pure sine wave. And if we look at the bass on its own, you can see that most of its frequency presence is not on that fundamental. And if we look at the EQ, we have high passed it. And the reason we did this is because the kick is very fat. It has a lot of frequency presence in the lower bass. And so we don't really need that in the bass synth itself, because the kick kind of makes up the sub-frequencies. So we high pass those sub-frequencies out of the bass itself to help it relate better with the kick and provide harmonics that the kick doesn't provide. Because if we didn't have that high pass on, it might, I'll turn it down quite a bit. The bass kind of gets a little bit too powerful. But at the same time, maybe you like that sound. It's what you do specifically is really up to you. But I did want to mention that. So you need to decide whether or not to high pass your basses. And just, if you're gonna high pass your bass, have a reason to high pass it. Don't just do it because someone said that they high pass their basses or said that you should high pass their bass. Because, that is something that you'll read about mixing acoustic music that doesn't really apply to all genres of electronic dance music. Especially things like trap or dubstep, where you want a huge sub-bass presence. In electro house or other kind of house genres, it might be more appropriate. So, you can high pass your bass if you want to, or you don't have to. And that's really up to you what you do. Now, another piece of advice that a lot of people give that I don't really think should be given in the way it is that you should high pass your non-bass sounds at a set frequency. You'll read that a certain person might high pass all of their non-bass sounds at 300 hertz or 400 hertz or whatever frequency, and they'll kind of say it as it's a given, it's a rule. And some tutorials do advise you to high pass everything that isn't your bass at a very specific frequency. But as I've said before, you shouldn't mix in a formulaic manner because every mix will be different. With some basses, you may want to high pass non-bass sounds at higher frequencies, but doing this with other basses may cause your mix to kind of lack a fullness. It might lack a warmth because you've filtered all of that out. And, the lower frequencies can be very important in certain sounds that aren't your bass to achieving a full sounding mix, depending on the mix and depending on what all is going on. So if we take a look at this example, which I looked at previously, you can tell that there's quite a bit of low end present, and it kind of fights with this kick here. But if I had a different kick, things might be a little bit different. So if this were my kick instead here, you can tell that, the bass isn't really interfering with the lead. It's just so low that it doesn't really interfere with that lead. So what you might end up doing is, if you were to high pass this lead sound, you might not high pass it quite as high as with that other really fat, huge kick. Because if you ask me, I like the way this lead sounds with a fair amount of bass. It makes it sound really full and really punchy. And so if I were to high pass it like this, it does sound good with this kick. But with this other kick, it kind of sounds a little bit empty in the upper bass and the lower mids as a whole. You know, maybe I don't want quite as much bass as without any high pass, but I might want more than what I would have with the other kick. And I might need to do some more processing to help it fit with the punch of that kick better. But you know, it kind of sounds a bit better with some of that fullness to it left in. So while it is kind of a good idea to remove any low frequencies of your sound that are interfering with your bass, you know, that's a great idea. It helps you get a clean mix. It helps your bass come through nice and clearly. But, you know, every bass is going to be different. You know, just automatically high passing all of your sounds at a set frequency, it might work in a number of different mixes, but then you might get to a certain mix where you have a very, very low bass with no harmonics. And all of a sudden your whole mix sounds really thin, and you're kind of wondering what's the deal because you've not done anything different than you've done before. And the problem is probably because you're removing too many frequencies from your non-bass sounds. So what I recommend is, yes, you know, use high pass to remove any frequencies of your sounds that are interfering with the bass, but do it on a case-to-case basis. And obviously, you're not going to high pass things that go along with this kick the same way you would high pass things that go along with this kick. So, you know, just do it on a case-to-case basis. And of course, in the example with the hi-hat, you know, if someone told you to high pass your hi-hats at a certain frequency, it's not really the best thing to do either, because you can hear that it will sound different when you're high passing it at, you know, this frequency than when you're high passing it at this frequency. And depending on the mix, this might sound better, or this might sound better. And it's really all about the mix. It's all about what you're trying to do within that mix. So I really encourage you to use your ears, trust your ears, and make any high passing. And I've been talking a lot about high passing, but also low passing. You know, make any EQ decisions in general based on what you hear and what you want to hear. Because it's truly going to vary between every mix. And now the final kind of misconception I want to take a look at is when people tell you to high pass. Some people might think that you are meant to use a very steep high pass and have, you know, your mix be really clean below that cutoff to open up more frequencies for your other sounds. But that's not really the case. You know, if you listen to this shaker sound, it sounds a little bit weird. It sounds a little bit unnatural with that really steep high pass. And that goes for low passes as well. So in some cases it will work. In some cases a steep high pass sounds best. But, you know, for this shaker sound, as an example, it just sounds a lot more natural with a more gentle high pass. And like the same is going to be true for this lead here. So if we look at that big kick, we might say that we need to cut off at around about 150 to clear room for that kick. So, if we did it really, really steep, it just doesn't sound super natural. And it might even be better to kind of, high pass it a little bit higher, maybe with a more gentle curve. Like, you can even hear it when it's playing with that kick. It doesn't sound as good with that really steep high pass cutoff as it does with the more gentle one. So, your goal isn't really to get everything super, super clean when you're high passing. It's just to remove enough frequencies to kind of clean up your sounds and prevent conflicts between your other sounds. And of course, there are certain cases where a steep high pass sounds fine. And snare drums are an example of this. You can see that if I high pass it pretty steeply below its punch frequencies, it sounds fine. So I find with things like kicks, snares, and certain other types of percussion, using really steep high pass filters sounds fine, as long as you're not, of course, filtering out the actual body of the snare. So, to decide how steep you want to high pass it, just really pay attention to how things sound. And, just try to keep things sounding nice and good and all that. But hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this either cleared up some misconceptions you may have had about high passing, or alternatively, hopefully it will prevent you from falling into those misconceptions in the future. And if you do have any questions about this, be sure to leave a comment or contact me via email or whatever. But yeah, hopefully this information was helpful.